Thanks very much, Drew. It's great to be here. It's my first Future Everything, and hopefully not my last. Well, I really appreciate you making the effort to get to the first session of the day, especially after such an exciting night last night. I'm going to tell you just a few stories from my forthcoming book, which is called Nature and Cyberspace, Stories, Memes and Metaphors. And it rather builds on my last book, which was called Hello World, Travels in Virtuality, which was about my personal experience of being online, living online, and living offline, and how the two kind of merge into each other. But this new book is not about me, it's about you and everybody else, and the way that you think and talk about your online life. So I've done a lot of research for this book over several years, and I've talked to a lot of people. So what I tell you about today is just the teeniest little snippet of what I found out. And also I need to apologise because in the blurb for this book I said I was going to make all kinds of connections, and I listed them very ambitiously and then realised there's no way I can cover it all. So this will just be just a little bit of it. If you want to know more, the website's here, thewildsurmise.com, and I'm always interested to hear from other people's experiences of the kind of thing I'm looking into, and your own stories and metaphors. The book mainly covers relationships between cyberspace and the natural world, and as Drew says, I've always felt that cities are not the be-all and end-all of cyberspace, and I know it's been kind of influenced because, you know, fair dues, William Gibson did invent the word, so it has that cyberpunk basis to it. But in my experience, cyberspace is not like a city for many people, so that's really what the book's about. Today I'm going to be focused on camping and surfing, and if time, streams and trees. Most of what I talk about, in fact all of it I think today, is based on people I've talked to in California, but I'm really interested in experiences from all over the world and all kinds of cultures. So again, please tell me if there are things you think I need to know. So, an early geek. In 1975, the Hackers Dictionary proclaimed rather proudly that, quote, many hackers don't follow or do sports at all. They're determinedly anti-physical. Just like this guy. Oh dear. But a couple of years ago, I visited Stuart Brand on his houseboat in Sausalito on the north side of San Francisco Bay. Brand's been involved with geekdom for many years. He set up the famous Whole Earth catalogue and also one of the earliest bulletin board communities, The Well. And my PowerPoint, I thought I turned off the automatic, but obviously I haven't. He said to me, the first engineers were very pale creatures. They stayed indoors or in the basement with the equipment. So when they came here to the West Coast from, say, Boston, we'd get them outside. The first hackers, he said, were basically male, fat and pale. But out here on the West Coast, at least the second generation started to do all kinds of things, and they were female, beautiful, adventurous, death-defying, travelling, nomadic people. That's what Stuart Brand said. Could it be true? Sounds quite optimistic. But here we have Chris Dunphy and Sherry Viard, who I heard at O'Reilly eTech a couple of years ago. For the last 4 years, they've been camping, not exactly in a tent, but in a camper van, which you can see here. And they describe themselves as 2 Generation X geeks using technology to engage in a full-time travelling lifestyle, which combines their high-tech careers with a rich and fulfilling life full of travel and adventure. So since 2007, they've been going back and forth across the US, covered over 30,000 miles, and earning a living online as they go. I'm waiting to see whether they're ever going to actually leave the mainland, maybe buy a boat and do the same thing offshore. But they're following in the footsteps of many other people who love both code and the great outdoors. This is John Postel. He was responsible for very important work on the early internet-related infrastructure addressing system. Without his work, navigating the internet would be much more difficult than it is today. His role was vital, highly technological, and in many ways he was the archetypal geek, quiet, shy, very focused on his work. He was held in very high esteem by his colleagues and much mourned when he died unexpectedly in LA in 1998 at the age of 55. The Economist wrote of him around that time, "If the net does have a god, he's probably John Postel." Now, those of people, the kind of popular image of people like Postel is that they're unhealthy indoor types who never leave their machines. So you might be surprised to hear that his memorial service included several readings, including one from the mountains of California, a seminal book by 19th century Scottish-born American environmentalist John Muir, who lived from 1838 to 1914. And in fact, despite the many hours that he did spend at his desk writing code, Postel was also a keen climber and hiker, and he'd often take off to the mountains to be alone and think. He was following in a venerable tradition. Almost 200 years after his death, John Muir remains the best-known environmentalist in the US. His passion for landscape and lyrical writings sustain his reputation as the archetypal nature geek. And he was very influential, most notably in 1904, the year Roosevelt was elected president of the US. Roosevelt realized he had a great deal of thinking and contemplation to do before tackling the huge agenda which lay ahead. So he wrote to John Muir out of the blue, asking if they could sneak off on foot together, he said, and rough it for a few days somewhere in Yosemite. He wanted to set aside politics in favor of communing with nature. And Roosevelt wrote to John Muir, "I don't want anyone to be with me but you, and I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days and just be out in the open." Which makes me think that maybe David Cameron should go camping with Ray Mears and chew a few witchetty grubs. That might help him sort out his priorities. Anyway, critic and writer Frederick Turner later called Roosevelt's trip one of America's, quote, most persistent dreams, creative truancy in the wild heart of the New World. And I think it's this sense of creative truancy which lies behind the popularity of geek camps and the rise of the tech nomad. Perhaps the best-known example of a conscious attempt to generate creative truancy was the FOO camp of 2003. FOO stands for Friends of O'Reilly, and to find out about the first ever camp, FOO camp, I talked to Tim O'Reilly himself and to Sarah Wing, the VP of O'Reilly Radar. And they told me how in 2003, when tech businesses were struggling to recover from the dot-com crash, the company decided that one of their explicit goals would be to inject hope into the industry. Sorry about this PowerPoint. Now, unlike companies like Apple and Google, who are firmly based south of the Golden Gate Bridge, O'Reilly had already built its offices 50 miles north of the bridge in the small town of Sebastopol, Sonoma County. Sebastopol is about 20 minutes from the Pacific, known for its liberal politics and small-town charm, according to Wikipedia. It used to grow mainly plums and apples, but now its orchards have been turned into vineyards for the most part. In 2003, O'Reilly had expanded their business campus with several new buildings, but due to the downturn, many of them were left empty. And it seemed to Sarah Wing and Tim O'Reilly that, because the industry was in a slump and urgently in need of new ideas, if you could get really interesting people together, maybe they will do interesting stuff and maybe something important could happen. And since they had all that space, why not invite people to their place to try it out? They wanted to do something rather different from the traditional conference with a pre-arranged program. So they looked at open space technology methods, a popular way of organizing unstructured conferences, and decided to begin the weekend with a completely open program where participants would be invited to step up and do a session themselves. Sarah told me that at the time, only she and Tim were excited by this plan. All their other colleagues thought they were nuts. So they devised an informal program which ran 24/7 from dinner on Friday night to lunch on Sunday. It was important that the campers themselves would add value to the event, so they hand-picked about 200 people who they thought would make useful contributions. Everybody would sleep on site, either in the empty buildings or outdoors if they preferred, and O'Reilly would feed them. They sent out the invites with some trepidation, weren't sure whether anybody would want to come, but within hours they got their first RSVP, an enthusiastic email from Ray Ozzie, then chief software architect at Microsoft and heralded by the New York Times as one of the world's greatest programmers. Ozzie was excited and more than happy to contribute. And this, said Sarah, made us think we were onto something. In the run-up to the weekend, they thought carefully about the layout. Many large Californian buildings have breezeways, which are open hallways that run between structures, designed to reduce the impact of high winds. They decided that they would make sure these breezeways acted as common routes to ensure that people were constantly passing each other as they were moving around the campus. This would encourage contact and networking, nurture new conversations and opportunities to work together, and they could do that either indoors, on the lawn, in the orchard, or wherever they liked around the campus. The idea was to create a temporary village that also had lots of Wi-Fi. At night, some of the guests camped out under the apple boughs or on the lawn, whilst others pitched tents actually inside the buildings or crawled into sleeping bags indoors. It was not so much about being outside, said Sarah Wing to me, as about the spirit of the camp. Some of them, she said, even they had dormer windows with deep sills, and some of them crawled onto the sills in their sleeping bags and slept there so they could look out and see the sky. Everybody agreed it wasn't like the usual Silicon Valley conference. So it was clearly a memorable adventure, but did it do what it intended, inject hope into the industry? John Battelle, a journalist working for CNN at the time, certainly thought so. He wrote afterwards, "When geeks go camping, ideas hatch. Get 200 or so smart folks with a lot in common together in one place, let them pitch tents, toss in a Wi-Fi network, and see what happens, and it turns out quite a lot." He lists numerous examples of collective brainstorming around problems like spam, search, indexing, peer-to-peer, and many others. And for relaxation, he reported, quote, "Campers drank microbrews, tossed frisbees, and, intriguingly, disassembled a Toyota Prius, then put it back together again." Clearly, this was not your average tech conference. And driving home at the end of the weekend, he thought to himself that maybe it just takes a couple of days in the woods to realise that we are well on our way out of them. And it seems that FOO really did release some new perspectives. Many conversations followed, and the next autumn, O'Reilly Media held their first Web2 conference, which did indeed spark a new surge of confidence in Silicon Valley. Very briefly, this is a picture of an attempt to also simulate the spirit of the camp, not make it happen, but simulate it. Google Open Social 2007. If you Google this, you'll find a really amusing video where Google tried to simulate the spirit of the camp on its campus. And I haven't got time to go into it all, but basically they gathered together on the campus. They were all given free open social blanket rolls and free open social camping chairs, and I think they had mugs as well, after a hard day's travail at the digital frontier. And if you watch the video, you see it really is quite amusing. But to move ahead to surfing, leaving camping behind, I wanted to mention J.C. Hertz, the author of the 95 classic Surfing on the Internet. It describes her pre-web student adventures as she rushes between bulletin boards, games, muds and moos, learning about the hidden and addictive 24/7 world, which was at that time, in 95, mostly occupied by academia and the US military. She begins the book tumbling dizzily out of an all-night session in the University Computer Centre and ends it with a dive into the sea. By the end of the book, she's been transformed from a naive newbie to a total nethead. And as her feverish account of life online draws to an end, she's beginning to realise the huge significance of cyberspace and its relation to the physical world. So on the very last page of the book, my favourite part, she writes, "The online and offline world aren't staying in their boxes like I thought they would. They're bleeding together. Today, I logged off at dawn, walked out of my apartment 4 blocks to the blue Atlantic and jumped in. Wow, I thought, now this is bandwidth." Hertz's book was a great success, but she wasn't the first to use the term surfing on the internet. It has quite a complicated history. I'll try to outline the background to it. Picture here you see in the bottom is Tom Mandel, who was a futurist at Stanford Research Institute, also a member of the Well with a reputation for being a rather difficult character. In the middle is Jean Armour-Polly, who was a librarian in the small town of Liverpool in New York State, 20 miles from Syracuse, and also a member of the Well. She joined in the summer of 1990 at the invitation of Steve Sisler from Apple's lab. And Steve Sisler was a librarian, but Apple didn't want to employ anybody with a title so boring as librarian, so they employed him as an information surfer. And he designed the mouse pad that you can see here, where it says Information Surfer, Apple Library Users Group. I've actually got quite a lot to say about this, and I probably haven't got time to go through it all. But basically, Jean Armour-Polly was asked to write an article for the Library Bulletin about what this strange new internet thing was. And she was looking for a metaphor that would make people really connect with it. And she actually owned one of these information surfer mouse pads that Steve Sisler had sent her through her work on the Well. And that was how she fell on that, and she thought, surfing the internet, that's a really good metaphor, that's what I'll use. So she published an article in 1992 called Surfing the Internet. Now, a year later, Tom Mandel wrote a similar article, which he called Surfing the Wild Internet, which was published in Time. And the two had to really talk to each other and talk about, well, who was going to actually claim provenance of this term surfing, which had really taken off in different directions. And I get the impression that Jean Armour-Polly would have been quite nervous about this because Tom Mandel had a very bad reputation for being snipey and nasty and aggressive on the Well. But he also was very dedicated to the spirit of cyberspace, and he was quite happy to agree with her that they would kind of have joint ownership of this term, surfing on the internet. They were also quite different in that he was very much a West Coast guy. He was already a surfer. He'd been brought up in Hawaii and learned to surf there. Jean Armour-Polly was very much an East Coast person. She'd never been to the West Coast, and this is the value of research, because I always assumed she had until I actually emailed her to find out. And she also told me on email that she doesn't even like swimming. So she thought that surfing was a very kind of exciting notion to use in terms of navigating the web. For her, it was a very romantic notion. The story ends rather sadly with few months after they'd made this agreement to share the accreditation for the term surfing the net, Tom Mandel discovered that he'd got a very fast-moving cancer, which he announced on the Well, as people did, and within 6 months he passed away. So this big dispute about the ownership of the term kind of paled into insignificance. His last piece for Time was a funny piece called Confessions of a Cyberholic. It was published the same month he died. And his byline said, "By day, Tom Mandel is a professional futurist. By night, he surfs the net." Jean Armour-Polly still works at Liverpool Public Library. She told me last year, I don't even like to swim, but my vision of surfing was that it was cool, dangerous, fun, hard to do and addictive. That was then. Another thing about surfing, which you might be unaware of, is that the first ever Mac casing was made of koa wood. There's a picture of it here. And koa wood is used actually also to make surfboards. And that leads me on to another connection, which I haven't seen mentioned in terms of surfing, but should be really. I'm told that when Polynesians think about navigation, apparently, they don't see themselves as moving on their surfboards or their canoes as moving through the sea, but they see themselves as being static and the sea moves past them, which seems to me is quite similar to you sitting in your chair as the internet moves past you. So a couple of interesting metaphors there to look at. Very briefly, zillions of tiny rivers. If we move away from the salt water and towards the fresh water, lots and lots of metaphors, as you know, if you think about it, about streams and rivers. BT Chief Scientist J.P. Rangaswamy calls Twitter, quote, zillions of tiny rivers connected yet apart. David Terra describes Twitter as a twisty canyon with a fast-flowing river. Thomas van der Waal, who invented the notion of folksonomy, calls it a flood and a creek. And of course, many people use the metaphor of a stream for apps like Twitter and also for the larger flow of data. Chris Anderson has written, we plug into the data stream as casually as we plug into an electric socket today. Now, in 1995, the data stream wasn't a rushing river, but an esoteric place for meditation. According to the Buddhist magazine Shambhala Sun, quote, cyberspace is frequently described as a feeling of complete and total immersion, in which the individual's observer self has thoroughly and effortlessly integrated and is at one with the experience of the moment. When the user sheds their gear, that download of new information is dumped into the offline data stream of our everyday lives to become part of the path, flow, or cyber cycles of our lives. And I love this quote, we download it, and it downloads us, and the cycle goes on and on. That was 95. But in 2008, I picked up a quote from a Facebook user called Laura Benesh in a Facebook group called Where Are You Now?, where people were just invited to post where they were at this minute. And she posted, my body is at home, but me, I'm flowing on the net. So it's still very much in use. Coming to the end of my 20 minutes, I've just got a bit of time to talk about some trees. Howard Rheingold. This is Howard Rheingold's outside office. Howard has a reputation for being thoroughly wired, but much of his online time occurs simultaneously, both in cyberspace and in the garden. He says, most people know me from cyberspace and they assume that I live there. I do spend many hours a day online, but what they don't know is that my body is sitting outside with my bare feet in contact with the earth. I don't know that I could live any other way. And at his home in Mill Valley, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, his summer office is a spacious wooden chair between a hydrangea bush and a sprawling plum tree. Here it is. And when the weather isn't warm enough to work outside, he writes about online community in a study overlooking the garden with the door leading directly to it. Thanks. And a visit to Howard often involves a walk to Mount Tam or Mount Tamalpais. If you Google the term the Church of Mount Tam, you'll find that lots of people have talked about or taken photographs of going for a walk up there with Howard to think and talk together. And surprise, surprise, it was also a famous hiking place for John Muir. Near Howard's house, you can also visit Muir Woods and Muir Beach. Okay, no more about trees. I have to leave that for the book. So to wrap up, why do geeks go camping? Well, so far, and I'm still working this through, I think it's about several different synergies. One is the fairly obvious balancing of intellectual energy with physical energy. We've all heard stories of difficult maths and science problems being solved the minute we stop agonizing over them and do something physical instead. Many aha moments come when the thinker tears herself away from the desk and goes for a walk or a run or a swim. So balancing intellectual and physical, very important. Another is about recognizing the similarity, and I feel very strongly about this. I'd be interested to know what you think, between the deep contemplative mode that programming often involves and the contemplation of nature. It's about connections between logic and the sublime, between cognition and emotion. And lastly, to return to John Muir and President Roosevelt roaming the mountains of California, I think it's about giving yourself space for some creative truancy. We can get creative truancy at events like this. In fact, we've had quite a lot of it already. But we can also get it either alone or in groups by deliberately spending time in a natural or a wild landscape. Now, I'm not saying that we should be unwired at those times. Personally, I like to be wired all the time. So it's not necessarily about being offline, although it can be. And in fact, in most American campsites now, they now provide wireless, so you can go and camp and be online at the same time. But this is a very personal thing, so I'd like to leave you with a suggestion that you spend some time when you come away from here thinking about your own moments of creative truancy. How do they happen? How can you make them happen more? And does connecting with nature make any difference to your personal process or not? Please let me know. Thanks.